Amen. Okay, so we're wrapping up chapter 9 and then starting chapter 10. If you've been following along, you're probably realizing by now that we are just going verse by verse, and sometimes that means we end at a spot that doesn't seem like it's a really great spot to end, and then we start at a spot that's like, where are we? But we're just going to keep doing our best. So we are in chapter 9, verse 35. If you recall last week, Jesus healed a handful of different people. And what's going to be very fascinating, and we're going to uncover a whole bunch of stuff about the rabbi-disciple relationship tonight. But what's really fascinating is what Jesus just did in the last chapter. Do you guys remember what he just did? He healed some people. Do you remember who he healed? He healed a lady. He raised a dead girl. He gave speech to someone who wasn't speaking, vision to someone who wasn't seeing. And then right here, right now, so we're already in chapter 10. This is the first time we're going to hear that there are 12 disciples. He's going to tell you who they are, and then he's immediately going to send them out and tell them to do exactly what he just did, which is really awesome. So let's jump in. We're going to read. We'll start at verse 35, and we'll just start to kind of pick the scripture apart tonight. And Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and affliction. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into the harvest." Pretty darn cool. I think the takeaway here is be careful what you pray for. You ever notice like that you feel like God calls you to pray for something, and then you realize that God's calling you to be the answer to your prayer, and you're like, oh, no, I was praying for somebody else to do that job, right? So I think the takeaway is be careful what you pray for. Okay, so I think we have to cover some interesting ground. Also, I hope Google.com written on here doesn't like trigger something on YouTube. You guys know YouTube has like all kinds of flags and stuff. Every time we post a video, it says like copyright infringement, and we're reviewing the content of this video. So hopefully that doesn't trigger it. Okay, so this is something very interesting. Jesus is teaching in the synagogues. Okay, this is actually kind of a big deal because it tells us a lot of things about Jesus. I think there's a better pen than this one. Maybe. So Jesus is teaching in the synagogue because Jesus is a rabbi. Okay, yeah, this is way better pen. So these two things are important, and I want you to notice this. Jesus is already having this very kind of tense relationship building with the Pharisees. One of the things the Pharisees never ever do is question that Jesus is a rabbi. Do you guys notice that? Now, this is very interesting because we don't know how Jesus got to be a rabbi. Well, we actually do know how Jews became rabbis, but we don't know the story of who Jesus learned with, who he followed, where the scriptures came from. But what we do know for certain is that these Pharisees are nitpicking every little thing that he says and does, but one thing they never, ever question is that he is actually a rabbi. Is that fascinating? So somewhere along the way, Jesus became a rabbi. And we could be tempted to say, oh, he's the Son of God, so he just knows the scriptures and he became that. That is possible, but I got to imagine if that's how that happened, the Pharisees would be after him all the time, and they never have a beef about this. Now here's the thing. Not every rabbi gets to teach in synagogues when they travel. This is kind of a very important type of rabbi. It's kind of an upper echelon, you could call it. I looked this up. The Hebrew word is, I don't know. I wish Phyllis was here. This is how they transliterate it into English. Shmika, I think is how you say it. Basically, this is a type of rabbi who is generally assumed to have been intelligent enough or able enough or proved himself enough that he is allowed to go into a synagogue and teach because he's able to make interpretations of the scripture that are teachable to people who would listen. Does that make sense? So it would be like somebody who is teaching at a seminary, for instance. You would want to vet them out. You would want to know what they're going to say about some of the controversial issues before you would give them the platform. So Jesus has already established in some way, shape, or form as a rabbi that he can be a traveling rabbi and he can go into a synagogue and he can teach there. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this when we get to the disciples. But let's talk about this scripture here. So he says that he is proclaiming the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction. We've already kind of noted this, but it's really important because he's going to tell the disciples to do the same thing. So a rabbi's job, does anybody know technically what a rabbi's job is? He teaches, but what does he teach? He teaches the Torah, and I think we've talked about this before. To teach the Torah in Jewish culture is not just to give somebody like some head knowledge. If you're a good teacher of the Torah, that means you give people knowledge to understand it. And the way you know that they were a good teacher is if the students do it. Does that make sense? It's actually embedded in the word Shema, which is the famous Jewish prayer, Hear, O Israel. The way that you know people hear it is if they actually do it. So to be a rabbi, your job is to teach the Torah in a way that people do it. Does that make sense? So it's very interesting that this is what it says. It says that he teaches in their synagogues. And what is he teaching? He's proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom. So that's repetitive. He's been doing that a lot. And healing every disease and affliction. So there's something about teaching the Torah correctly that Jesus says the way that you live out the Torah is that you are doing healing. That's the proper way to live this out, as you're bringing wholeness and fullness of life to people. When he saw the crowds, in verse 36, he had compassion for them. I think I put a footnote. I always laugh. This word compassion in Greek, it means that your bowels shake. I always just think that's hilarious. So it says that Jesus' bowels shook for them. So this is an interpretive decision to say, you know what, we're not going to have Jesus' bowels shaking every page in English. But that's literally what it means. It means that he's like moved from the inside out is kind of the concept. He's moved because they were harassed and helpless. I think I put a footnote that literally these words mean they're distressed and they're set aside and they're forgotten. They're sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest and send out laborers into the harvest. This phrase, like sheep without a shepherd, it shows up throughout the Old Testament. Some examples I wrote down: Numbers 27, 1 Kings 22, Jeremiah 50, 2 Samuel 24. Basically, I don't list all that just to tell you all the areas that quote this scripture. The idea is that in different times throughout history, everybody is using this phrase and it means the same thing. It means that the people who are given authority to lead are not leading. They're abandoning the people they're meant to lead. So Jesus is quoting it almost as like hey, remember when it was written in Numbers. Remember when it was written in 1 Kings. Remember when it was written in Samuel. All these examples are that the leaders that were given authority to lead the Israelites fail to do it, and they neglect and harm the sheep. And then Jesus says, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. It's just a cool illustration to a whole bunch of people hanging out in agricultural territory, isn't it? I think the idea that Jesus is saying is that stuff that we learned in the Sermon on the Mount, the stuff that comes from the inside of who we are, the stuff that produces fruit, Jesus says there is fruit out there. It's ready to be harvested. There's people who are hungry to hear the message of the kingdom. They're ready to be harvested, but there's nobody there to lead them. So pray for people who would lead them. Okay, let's pause for a moment. Any questions, any thoughts? We're going to get into the disciples, which are going to be pretty interesting. Nobody, okay. Yeah.
So this phrase, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few, is that a reiteration of their relationship with
I didn't make that connection, but as you're saying it, it makes sense to me. Like the two go together.
Yeah.
So I think what Lisa's saying is sheep without a shepherd are the same as there's fruit on the vine, but there's no one to pick it. Almost like the people who should be picking the fruit are too busy doing other things. Makes perfect sense to me. I didn't make the connection, but yeah.
I have another question on the rabbis. Him being able to enter a synagogue, like coming in here and just going up and teaching. Did the other rabbis have any problems with that? And did the other rabbis have the authority to heal like Jesus did and do the things that Jesus did?
So not all rabbis are able to just walk in and teach in a synagogue. So there's a scene where Jesus walks into a synagogue and people are seated listening. By the way, we're going to talk about this in a second, but a rabbi almost always had disciples following them. Jesus is not the only rabbi with disciples. Disciples were following them. A disciple's job was to study and listen and follow everything your rabbi does because you want to be exactly like them. This is getting way ahead of it, but we're in good territory. So here's the deal. A rabbi would teach and teach and teach. A disciple was to follow no matter where they went. They were not even supposed to question where the rabbi is taking them, which explains why Jesus could get in a boat and take them to Gentile pig cemetery land. You guys remember that story? And they don't ever question it. They're probably freaked out. They don't even voice their freak out. Why? Because you just do what your rabbi says. When a rabbi determines that you are as close to like him as you possibly can be, the way that a rabbi would release a disciple to go pursue being a rabbi and choosing their own disciples, he would say something like, "Go and make disciples." Is that ringing any bells? Yeah, that's what he would say. He would say, like, you have a grasp of the Torah. You live the Torah. You are a faithful Jew. Now go be released and go make disciples. Right? They don't add this little piece that Jesus is going to say where he says, go into all the nations. Jews would say, like, and try to make Gentiles into Jews. That doesn't make any sense. But so some rabbis, yes. Some rabbis, no. It's totally dependent. But again, Jesus goes into synagogues and he just teaches. The Pharisees come after him for what he says, but they never say, you're not qualified to be doing this. They never once say anything like that. So I think we're going to get even deeper into your question here in a second. Okay. We're gonna go on a... Yeah, Cecil.
What's the difference between the Torah and the Book of Moses, and what were the Pharisees teaching at that time? Were they teaching from the Book of Moses, or were they teaching?
So the two, when Jesus is living, are basically synonymous with one another. The Book of Moses is thought to be one single volume, not a book, but maybe one scroll that would have the first 5 books of what we know as the Old Testament, the Torah. Those are the books associated with Moses. So they're the same thing, more or less. What they're teaching is, as far as content is concerned, I believe that they're teaching things very similar to Jesus. I think where they start to veer off is the interpretation, because like we've been noting, Jesus calls them to like a moral and ethical like ground that's much more significant. It's giving your life away for the benefit of others. It's not pushing people to the side. So I think Jesus in many ways is probably raised in a Pharisee culture, and he probably has a lot of the same beliefs, right? We have a lot of the same beliefs as other people, but when we look in on them and we realize their behavior is not adding up to their beliefs, I think that's Jesus's main issue with them. Not so much what they believe in their mind, but how they actually live out their beliefs. So to give you one example, just so you know, is like Pharisees believe in the resurrection. So clearly Jesus believes in the resurrection. The Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. So he has more in common with the Pharisees in a lot of ways than he would the Sadducees. So, interesting. So my understanding is Jews have the Torah. Then they have these rabbinical documents written by rabbis. They have the Talmud is what it is. It's like a living commentary on how to live out the Bible. What happened over time is that some Jewish kind of sects, they decided that one of the authoritative teachings is not just the Torah, it's the tradition. So what old rabbis wrote were held up as this is legitimate authority from God, just like the Torah. So maybe there's a confusion of the two. Let's jump into the disciples here. And he called to him his 12 disciples. So if you've been reading along, this is the first mention ever that we now have 12. Jesus has used the word that he had his disciples when he taught the Sermon on the Mount. This is the first time we've heard 12. So keep that number in mind, because if you're Jewish, that starts sending off all kinds of alarm bells. So he called to him his 12 disciples, and he gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every disease and every affliction. And here are their names. Some of them we've already met. Some of them, this is the first time we're hearing about them. The names of the 12 apostles. Notice the difference. The first time in verse 1, it introduces them as disciples. In verse 2, it introduces them as apostles. Let's see. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother. James, the son of Zebedee, and John his brother. Philip and Bartholomew. Thomas and Matthew the tax collector. James, the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus. Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. You can underline that. Betrayed him. If you're reading Matthew for the very first time and you're just entering what we know as chapter 10, we just got introduced to all these guys we've never heard of. They are the 12 disciples. We're going to talk about that in a second, because this is a big deal for a rabbi to have disciples. We're questioning, why on earth are these the disciples? And now we find out Jesus has a disciple, and they're foreshadowing something we don't know about if we're just reading this, that he has a disciple that betrays him. That's sort of generic. We don't 100% know exactly what that is going to mean. But we're getting a glimpse that something is going to happen to this Jesus guy that we're learning about. Okay, let's talk, because there's all kinds of crazy stuff going on here. By crazy, I mean awesome. What do we know about the number 12 in the Bible? 12 tribes, exactly. And where did the tribes come from? They came from Israel. And who was the father? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Jacob his name is changed to Israel. And how many sons does he have? He has 12 sons. They become the 12 tribes. Because this is God ordained, right from the start, Jews begin to think that the divine idea for government, don't think like elected government, just think that the way that God wants his people to be organized and governed is in this 12 tribes mold. This is the perfect way that God desires for them to be led and governed. So there's the 12 tribes, and the tribes have elders, and they oversee the worship system and who does what, all these sorts of things. Jesus comes in, and we find out that he has 12 disciples. I did some digging, and it turns out that most rabbis have somewhere between like 5 and 30 disciples at once. So 12 totally fits what was normal, but it's interesting that we have exactly 12. So let's talk really briefly about this. This idea of 12 disciples. Do you remember a handful of weeks ago we started talking about Jesus is, in the way that Matthew is telling us about Jesus, he's almost going back in Israel's history and retelling the story as though it were redeemed. So, for instance, Jesus goes out to the Jordan to be baptized in the water, and then he re-enters Israel. Do you remember that story? And the language that was used, we pointed out, was very similar to how the Israelites go through the Red Sea on their way to the Promised Land. That it's this somehow leaving the old thing behind in the desert and coming in. So I think what Matthew is doing is he is trying to make sure you know, because he could just list them and then leave it up to you to just count them. Instead, he wants you to know right up front that there are 12. Excuse me. So what is Jesus doing? He's preaching this message that the kingdom of heaven has come. And now he's telling you that I've chosen 12 disciples, which every Jew knows is the perfect number for organizing the people. I think what Jesus is doing is he's almost like pushing refresh on the button of how this organization is going to work. So let's talk about these guys for a second. Because if you were going to start a really successful movement or company or whatever you want to call it, and you were told you get to pick 12 people, what kind of people would you choose? Hard workers. Okay? Intelligent. Loyal. Dependent. Dependable, yeah? The opposite of dependent, right? Yeah. When I think dependent, I think like 25-year-old son still living like, Mom, can I just have $10, you know?
They always try to choose people with different experience or expertise.
Okay. It seems to me that Jesus, as far as we know, we cannot quite get our arms around why on earth are these his disciples. Other than Jesus is walking on the seashore and he just decides, I'm going to start calling disciples. There's no major rhyme or reason. We know a handful of things about each one of these guys. The first thing I want to say before we even talk about the disciples is this. That almost always, and as far as I know, always with the best rabbis, when you had a really good rabbi, this is not a super good, it's not a super good analogy, but I think it'll do the trick. Think of a rabbi as like a prestigious university. Students have to apply to get in, right? So the students are the ones pursuing the university, and the university literally just says approve or deny, right? In the ancient world, this is how rabbis worked. Students came to the rabbi and basically asked them, can I follow you? Can I follow you? Then the way the rabbi said, yes, you can follow me, would be to look at them and say, yes, come follow me. That was an invitation. Do you notice something missing when Jesus calls his disciples? They don't ask. They don't ask at all. This is very, very unique. It's very unique also because Jesus doesn't get any flack that he's not a real rabbi. So he's just walking on the seashore and he calls out. Remember, he calls out to 4 fishermen right out of the gate. Come follow me. 2 of them are looking around and their dad is like, are you kidding? You got to go. This is crazy. So here's the thing. Almost all the students who are pursuing following a rabbi have already checked off all the boxes. More or less, they have a great grade point average. They did well on the SAT. They wrote a great essay. They feel qualified. Here's the thing we know about some of the disciples. If you are in a boat fishing, so the first 2, we get Peter and Andrew, yeah, his brother. I don't know why I was trying to say John. So Peter and Andrew, they are in the boat fishing. That's all we know about them. Then we get the second set, which are James and John. And they are in the boat, and they are fishing, but who else is in the boat with them? Their dad. His name is Zebedee, right? Zebedee. So this right away tells us something. It tells us that James and John in the Jewish culture are not old enough to have learned the trade to be doing it all on their own, but Peter and Andrew are. We also know something else about Peter that tells us he's a little bit older, which is what? Do you know? He's married, yeah. Peter's married. We know that because Jesus heals his mother-in-law. I can't tell you how many jokes I've heard pastors say when he goes to heal the mother-in-law. But you can go look them up. Okay, so we get this idea. So Peter and Andrew, they're brothers. They've learned a family trade. Their dad has said, you know what? You know everything there is to do about fishing for the family business. You're going to take your own boat. I'll stay in my boat now. So they are probably, in this Jewish culture, they are probably late teens, early 20s. Most Jewish men were getting married between like 18 and 20 years old, some as young as 15, 16. So it's possible they're a little younger, but they're kind of late teens, early 20s. Then we learn, goes a little further, James and John, they're in the boat with their dad. That tells us that they're not old enough to have learned this trade well enough for their dad to say, go off on your own. So we can imply that they're either younger or they're really bad fishermen. I don't know. Okay, so they're probably teenagers. Some of the other things that we know that all Jewish boys went to school, and there was basically 2 or 3 main cutoff points. So all these boys go to school. When they're about 13, they're loosely going to school, and then they kind of go do the family trade, or they go do their uncle's trade or a relative's trade if they're not pursued to continue their education. By 15 years old, the really good students, all boys in this culture, are then pursuing following a rabbi. And I've heard different numbers. I've heard that it's between like 1% and 6% actually end up being so good at this Torah memorization and learning the interpretations thing that they actually go follow a rabbi. Is that making sense to everyone? So Jesus, this is what I want you to get. Right off the bat, Jesus picks some people who definitely didn't get to this point because they're fishing. And they definitely are not qualified to be disciples. Probably at all, but definitely not with a rabbi who is qualified to just travel, enter a synagogue, and ask for a scroll off the wall and start teaching. So who is Jesus choosing?
People he doesn't have to untrain.
Oh, that's a good point. Wow. You say that with like some conviction, like you got like a bone to pick with someone, Kevin. People he doesn't have to untrain. So this is the system Jesus is in. I think more than trying to figure out exactly why he chose them all, I think this is the thing. Jesus picks 12 disciples. It's an illustration that he's going to rebuild the structure of how the kingdom of heaven operates. And it operates by being entrusted to people who, by the world standards, don't qualify, more or less. That's who he has. Okay. Let's see. I think did I give you a full description of all the disciples there? We don't have to go through all of them. I'm gonna be honest with you. I was up very late last night trying to seek out. So I know some Greek, and I know just enough Hebrew to get in trouble, and I know 0 Aramaic. But when you start looking up these names, a lot of them are like mismatch of like Hebrew and Aramaic and even some Greek. And so there's a lot of dispute about like what their names mean, and if their name means this, then you can infer this. I went down those rabbit trails, and it's not worth going down. Just want to tell you that. Okay, so let's see. Oh, this is interesting. So in verse 1, we learn that they are 12 disciples. And then in verse 2, it says that the name of the 12 apostles. You guys notice that? Now the 2 words are not necessarily interchangeable. They mean different things. Some people will say, oh, they're called disciples mostly when Jesus is alive, and then once he is resurrected, they're called apostles. Well, that doesn't make any sense because we just read in back-to-back verses that he calls them both. The word disciple, it just means like learner or pupil or follower of a rabbi. It's somebody that's inferring that they're learning. An apostle, it could be a disciple, but an apostle is a messenger, but it's a messenger that's been sent. So I think what Matthew just wants you to know right out of the gate is that these guys have been called to be learners, and then immediately Jesus is going to send them out. Now this makes 0 sense if you're Jewish. It makes 0 sense because the majority of disciples would come learn with a rabbi, and they would keep their mouth closed. They would take vigorous notes. They would follow him wherever he led. And then when he asks them questions, he expects them to have an answer immediately. So we learned this maybe in our class before we started Matthew. A common Jewish rabbi thing to do would be to quote one tiny phrase of a scripture And the disciple was understood to, you got this far, you better know the rest of the verse, and you just keep quoting it, right? Jesus does this when he takes the scroll of Isaiah. He reads a chunk of it, and he infers that everybody knows how the scripture ends. But this process, from everything I can read, usually would go on for multiple years before the rabbi would be comfortable saying, you know what, I want to give you some airtime to do a little practice teaching on your own. Does that make sense? Jesus calls the 12, and then he sends them out immediately. This is like sketchy territory. What if they represent him poorly? What if they say something really stupid and heretical? Right? I think we can like chuckle or smile. Or we're going to read this scripture and we're going to realize that what I'm going to tell you is that Jesus did not reserve sending out only the select few that got promoted because they're really smart. Because he doesn't have any that are really smart. He selected disciples and he immediately sends them out. That tells me this is a rule of faith for all disciples who follow Jesus. They're going to be sent out. I think sometimes we act as though like, oh, if I learn the Bible well enough and I worship enough and I go to church enough, maybe one day I'll participate in ministry. This is Jesus' way of doing ministry. You're my disciple. Do you agree? Yes. Cool. I need you to go cleanse some lepers and cast out demons. You just saw me do it. And now I'm going to empower you to do it. So we're going to get there in a second. Let's talk about Judas and a couple of these other guys really quickly. A couple things that I found interesting. Some of them are just, I didn't know. So I didn't know that Philip means that he was a lover of horses. It's kind of interesting. Makes me think, what did this guy think when they're sitting around and Jesus says, hey, I need you to go into the next town and get me that donkey? I wonder if Philip was like, can we not do horses? I love horses. It's my name. I don't know.
One picked to go talk to the guy in the chariot, so.
Yeah. I think that's a different Philip in Philip the eunuch. I don't think it's the same exact one. Couple others. Let's see. Simon the Zealot. Oh, we should definitely talk about him. Because I think his name addition in here. Let's see. How do I want to say this? So we have Peter, whose name is also Simon, right? But as we're listing the disciples, if Matthew wanted to avoid controversy, he could get down to who we know as Simon the Zealot, which is a descriptive word. Notice that none of the others have a description. So why are you telling us his vocation? He doesn't call him, he called Peter the fisherman or Matthew the tax collector. Maybe he does with Matthew the tax collector. He does say the tax collector. So he gives two vocations. He says Matthew the tax collector. We talked about him the other day, so I'll just leave it at that. If you wanted to avoid controversy, you would have just called him Matthew. And then he says, Simon the Zealot. So let's talk about this for a second. Anybody know anything about the Zealot movement? They want to overthrow Rome, and they want to overthrow any Jews that get in the way too. They have no problem. So they're all about revolt and revolution. There is some documentation of this that you could find pretty easily. That basically there's a chunk of the Zealots. It doesn't mean that Simon's part of it. We don't actually know. But there's a chunk of the Zealots that have just turned to purely violent means. And it's documented that one of the things that they would do, they would leave like major Roman city centers and go out in the desert, wait for night. Then they would come in and they would basically put hits out on Roman soldiers. And that's what they were doing. They were trying to strike fear in Roman soldiers and outposts that we're coming for you. This is our land and we're going to take it back even if we have to be violent. And so Matthew tells us that Jesus has a disciple that's affiliated with that. I think in the first century, I could be wrong. I think what he's trying to tell you is Jesus has some super, super radical political people in his inner circle. That doesn't Sounds sometimes like how we want to understand Christians, now does it? So this is who's in his inner circle. I think
Does that also describe the spectrum? Because those two would be at opposite ends of the social spectrum. The tax collector, who's all about the Roman culture, and the zealot, who's all against.
Are you saying that this guy might want to put a hit? He might want to whack him?
They probably wouldn't skip down the road.
No, they definitely wouldn't. For Jesus to call them together, I'd like to see that interaction, right? Okay, 2 more things, and then we're going to move on. I know I say that over and over. I'm like, 2 more, 5 more things, 6 more things. I forgot to say this. I think sometimes this is a misunderstanding, and I used to have this all the time. But rabbis and disciples, I used to have this vision that disciples just go follow the rabbi, and then they're just like off on this grand adventure. It turns out that that's not actually true, that rabbis and disciples still provided for themselves. Maybe not to the same extent, but what was common is in Jewish law, actually, a disciple who was married, so Peter, for sure that we know of, could go with his rabbi for 30 consecutive days without his wife's permission. The second it went longer than that, he either needed to return home or he needed her permission to be gone longer than that. Basically, it was like a cultural thing that he is a man over a household and they need him for well-being. So we know that they're allowed to go with Jesus for 30 days by law, but after that, they got to return home, which actually makes sense if you follow where Jesus is going. He's kind of crisscrossing, but a lot of the places he keeps intersecting are where he's called them from. So they're probably still doing some of their jobs. What was common for rabbis is when they went out on a teaching trip, for instance, they would often take like what we would call an offering. So we know that, especially like in the book of Acts and beyond, that there are a handful of prominent women who are funding people like Paul on his travels. So this is pretty common. I didn't totally know that. The last thing I want to talk about is Judas. We know a couple things about Judas. We know that Judas in some way knows what to do with money, right? Because he's basically given the task of being the financial guy who holds the money bag. So he knows something about money. In the ancient world, if you know something about money, you probably have at least some formal education on what to do with it. You learned it from your dad, and so that's kind of a higher level of kind of social status. So this is what we know about Judas. The second thing that we know about him is that Matthew just wants us to know ahead of time that he betrays Jesus. Now this word is interesting because this word I think Matthew uses on purpose because this is a generic word that means lots of things. I put a couple examples here. This is the exact same word that Matthew uses when he says that John the Baptist is arrested. It's also the exact same word that Jesus uses in Matthew chapter 5 when he says that you should settle a dispute with your adversary before you go to court, because if you don't, you could be handed over to the court. So I think what Matthew is doing is he's using this loose term that if you're reading Matthew, you think, well, what does that mean, right? What does it mean that he's going to betray Jesus? Is he going to get him arrested? Is he going to abandon him? Is he going to sell him out? And it makes you want to continue reading. Okay. Any thoughts or questions from here? Yeah.
Well, Judas handed him over to the Sanhedrin.
Yeah.
So it matches settled the dispute and be handed over to the court.
Yeah, it's interesting. So he gets handed over, and that's inevitably what we know. I think what I'm saying is sometimes we know the end of the story. I'm just saying, like, if you didn't know the story, you would be thinking, like, what does this mean? This guy that we've never met, that just got introduced as one of the inner 12, is going to betray him? Is that something we should be tracking through this story? When is that going to happen? It's like building suspense. This is just really good writing. Okay, make sure I didn't forget anything. Okay.
Do you think him saying that was, out of animosity, or
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
do you think him saying that was out of animosity towards, he wanted to discredit Judas as a disciple right away? Like, don't think that this guy was a true disciple, or
Interesting. So if he's writing in like retrospect, clearly he's writing about events that have already happened. So he's almost like telling the audience ahead of time, this is a guy you should watch out for. This is not a good guy. This guy doesn't belong with the other 11.
yeah, like he doesn't want him to be lifted up or put on that same pedestal as a disciple of Jesus.
Yeah.
And
I think totally true. To be honest, I can't recall the other interactions with Judas. The only thing I can remember is that when they do the Last Supper, Jesus serves them all, and he says full well, there's one of you that's here that's taken the cup that's going to betray me. And they all start talking about, like, who's it going to be, right? But that makes sense to me that he's like wanting to discredit him up front. Could totally be. Okay, so this is, let's see, verse 5. These 12 Jesus sent out, instructing them, go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Remember that first statement he made, that they are like sheep without a shepherd. I think what Matthew wants you to know is he just got the shepherds and now he's sending them out there. And proclaim as you go, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, and cast out demons. You received without paying, give without pay. Acquire no gold or silver or copper for your belts, no bag for your money, or 2 tunics or sandals or a staff. For the laborer deserves his food. Okay, a couple things here. I think, where's my pen? The word here, laborer, is an interesting word. And we'll talk about it in a second, but you might want to underline it. So I think the first thing that we have to notice here is that these guys have just been called, and now they're being sent. Everybody sees that. This is why I think this matters. Because I think in our minds, we could be fooled into this idea that Jesus is promoting them for being really good at what they do, right? Like, you've been here a while, you're a hard worker, we want to promote you to a new pay grade. That is clearly that's not happening. What's happening is he is commissioning them. And this idea of commissioning, I already kind of alluded to it in Jewish culture, is the idea that the rabbi thinks his disciples are ready, in part, to go out into the world and act like him. Which I think every Jew that's reading and hearing this is thinking, this is ridiculous. These guys clearly have no formal training, that most of them are like fishermen. Now you call them, they've been with you for 9 chapters, now you think they're ready to go out into the world. To give you an idea, Jesus is probably in his early 30s, and do you remember what it says when he starts his earthly ministry? It says he started his earthly ministry. Why? Because that was the age usually when rabbis kind of branched off and did their own thing. So in their 30s, so around 30 years old. So these are like youngsters, we're talking teenagers, and Jesus says, you didn't come to me, I came to you. It's a great honor that I would come to you. I'm calling you disciples. Now I'm saying you're in the inner circle. Like, whoa, this is unheard of. Now I'm saying that I already trust that you could be enough like me that I would trust you out in the world. So he says, he's instructing them, I don't want you to go among the Gentiles or to the Samaritans. So let's talk about that. No Gentiles. What's up with this? What do you guys think? Why no Gentiles?
That's because Jews first.
Jews first? Why? Okay. So there's like a cultural connection? It was definitely prophesied, yeah.
As what was said earlier, untrain them.
What's that?
Untrain them, right? If
To untrain them? I think in some part it's part of the covenant. Like God has promised that they are his people and he will be their God. I think what's about to happen is going to shed some light on this, but he says, Jews first. Something I think we have to, let me make sure I'm not getting ahead of myself here. I think we can talk about it now. So these guys are called to go out to the Jews, and they're called to be an extension of Jesus. So let's talk about what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to proclaim the kingdom of heaven and say that it's at hand. So this is the same exact message that John the Baptist spoke, and it's the same exact message that Jesus spoke. They are to heal the sick. I wrote down a couple examples. Jesus heals the sick in chapter 8 and in 9. They're called to raise the dead. Jesus just raised the dead in the last chapter, chapter 9, starting at verse 18. They're called to cleanse lepers. They saw Jesus cleanse a leper in chapter 8, starting at verse 2. Cast out demons. He's done that a couple times. The most recent one was in at the end of chapter 8. So they are supposed to go do and be an extension of Jesus. So this is what I really think is just as simple as this. Jesus trusts that they can go out into the world and be like him already, which is absurd. But he believes it so much so that he doesn't give them okay, you're going to do a 3-week intensive training. I'm going to teach you how to argue. I'm going to teach you some of the basics you didn't learn because you weren't good at school. None of that. You've been watching me. I think that's plenty. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to proclaim the same message, and I want you to do exactly the same thing that I have already done. So he tells them, you're going to go to the Jews and only the Jews. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But let's talk about their appearance, because he has some specific directions for them. He says that you basically cannot charge people because you can't charge people for something you got for free. That's more or less. Verse 9 says, acquire no gold or silver or copper for your belts, no bag for your journey. Let me write these things down. So this word, the bag, I looked it up. This is like a storage, in my mind, I think like a duffel bag, like taking some extra clothes. Basically, Jesus says, you don't need that because all the extras, I don't want you to bring that. So nothing to even carry the extras in. No 2 tunics, which means the one that you're wearing is the only one you get to wear, the only one you get to have. So 1 set of clothes. Everybody was smelly. Yeah. You know what somebody told me once, and it makes this even more disgusting? These roads, the reason that they are roads is not because humans walk on them. They're roads because they have traffic for goods coming and going from different places. Pen down. Which means animals are bringing carts back and forth, and animals are going poop all over the road. You ever read what kind of footwear these people are wearing? Sandals. Yeah. Dirty folks, smelly folks. But if everybody is smelly, how do you know? You'd have to be especially stinky to be so much stinkier than the other stinky people for anyone to notice, right? Okay, so no bag, only the clothes on your back. It says, or 2 tunics or sandals or a staff. Now, there is a little bit of some pushback here. Some people say what he's saying is you're not allowed to even wear sandals or bring a staff. I'm of the opinion that what he's saying is you can't bring 2 of those things. You get the shoes on your feet and 1 single staff. For the laborers deserve his food. So you get the clothes on your back, the shoes on your feet, and you get 1 staff. That's my reading of this. I could be wrong. And now you're going to go. Anybody else kind of freaking out? Anybody else feel like, man, thank you, God, that you chose them to do this extreme work and not me? Wrong. I put a quote here. This is from Stanley Hauerwas, who's a very famous New Testament scholar. He says, they are charged to have nothing at their disposal other than the authority that they have been given by Jesus. That's the only extra they get. Interesting. Okay. So let's talk about what they look like. You're walking down the road. You literally have nothing. It's not like you're just going from your house to your friend's house. You're going on a commissioned trip to speak the words of your rabbi. So what do these people look like right now? I'll give you a hint. I told you to underline the word. What's that? Not a shepherd. A laborer, yeah. And this word in the first century is a specific word. This is somebody who wakes up every day with the food that they ate the night before and no money to buy any more food, and so feet to the ground, right back in the field to work, just enough to get enough money to provide for one more day until you do it again. That's what they're dressing like, that's what they're looking like, and they have no money on them. So this is what they look like. And Jesus says that you are going to go. So they are looking like a day laborer. A day laborer, more or less, would kind of sign on to these little deals and contracts where, hey, I can commit to you for 5 days. Can you give me 5 days? Cool. Once the 5 days are up, you're back on the street. Maybe you miss a day of work. Maybe you miss 3 days of work. This is how a lot of people end up selling themselves into slavery to pay back their debts. Like, I'm so hungry, I'll sell myself to you if you would just feed me, right? That's what these guys are asked to look like and act like and get sent out. And then this is what Jesus says. And whatever town or village you enter, find out who is worthy in it and stay there until you depart. Anybody have a question about what on earth that means? I wrote in the margins. What was your question?
Going into a strange house,
Going into a strange house.
parking yourself there and feed me and give me a room and a bath and everything else.
I think that's exactly what it's saying. My question that I wrote in the margins, it says, find out who is worthy and stay there. My question was, how do you know if they're worthy?
I believe they're believers. I think they're maybe seeking believers.
I think that that's definitely part of it, but I think there's actually kind of one step before that. So let's keep reading. As you enter the house, greet it. And if the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. So I still have the same question. How do you know if it's worthy or not? And if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet when you leave that house or town. Truly I say to you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. Yikes. Yeah, woe is right. If you don't know Sodom and Gomorrah, go look it up. I'll reference it here in a second, but it's not pretty. Okay, so let's talk about verse 14, because I think verse 14 tells us the key to how do we know if someone is worthy or not. The first thing Jesus says, if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about receiving and hearing your words, because I think one goes before the other. So this is still like this to this day. Anybody know the story, the famous military story where the guy he's a Navy SEAL, he gets in a firefight and he is saved by the village? It was turned into a Mark Wahlberg movie. You guys know? Lone Survivor. Do you guys know this story? Long story short, a group of them, like 4 or 6 of them, very small, they're dropped off miles away in a helicopter to go just take some pictures and figure out what's going on in this remote Afghanistan village. They're trying to figure out, is this where Taliban members are coming from? Anyways, they go, and they end up in a huge, massive firefight. Not with the village, but they're ambushed. Everybody dies except one guy. Marcus Luttrell is his name. Basically, he's severely wounded, he's in terrible condition, and he falls basically down a mountainside into the lap of this very remote foreign village. The village, it turns out, holds to this code of Eastern hospitality, and they say to the Taliban, we don't give a rip who this guy is. If, like, the gods brought him to us, we will protect him at all costs because our highest value is hospitality, so you have no business in our village. Leave, more or less. Because this guy is in our presence. We don't care where he's from, what his business is here. He is here, and now it is our job to protect him, to feed him, to care for him. It's a super extreme story, and they basically hold on to him, even though they're remote villagers with no firepower or anything, in the face of the Taliban wanting to come kill him. That's the story. The idea is that type of hospitality spurns out of the exact same culture. That if somebody comes to your house and knocks on the door and says, I have nowhere to go, I have nothing to do, the Torah says that you should do what? You should receive them. Okay, that's what it says you should do. Do you think everybody actually does that? I would guess, I don't know for a fact, but if somebody knocked on your door and you opened it and they were wearing nice clothes and they had gold rings on their hand and a big old bag full of stuff, you might be a little bit more apt to say, this guy looks like a clean, well-to-do guy. Sure, come on in for dinner. I'll follow the Torah because you seem like you're good people, right? If a guy knocks on your door and he has nothing to his name but just a tunic, one pair of sandals, no money at all, and is asking for hospitality, probably less likely to get hospitality, right? But the Torah is clear. When the foreigner or somebody you don't know enters, your job is to give them hospitality. So I think verse 14 says this, if anyone will not receive you, so the first prerequisite is they have to receive you, right? So now you're looking like a day laboring beggar. You knock on the door, hey, can I have hospitality here? Anybody who says yes is saying yes, assuming that you are the poorest of the poor and the lowliest of the low. That's how they're assuming they're receiving you. So if they say, yes, come on in, I'll make you a hot meal, I'll give you a place to rest, what kind of person is this? This is Jesus' kind of person, right? So right off the bat, anyone who receives you, if they don't receive you, leave immediately, right? That's what he says. If they don't receive you, shake the dust off your feet. We'll talk about that in a second. Yeah, David.
So, yeah, I think that goes hand in hand with what it says in Proverbs. It says, don't waste your breath on fools.
Yeah, it does.
So they're not worthy of receiving that, but they're not going to be accepting of a wise man's word.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think consider this. Who is Jesus hanging around? Who are the people coming to him? The poor, lepers, beggars, blind, demon-possessed, hemorrhaging women. These are the people, right? So Jesus is saying, if you're going to go out and act like me, and you're going to try to find people that, remember he said the harvest is there, you got to find it. If you're trying to find people who are ready to be harvested, you're looking for people who are understanding people like I do. And that is somebody who's willing to open arms, welcome in somebody who looks like they're destitute and have nothing to their name. So that's the first thing. They have to receive you looking like this. If they don't, wipe the dust off your feet and leave. If they do, the second thing it says is what? Listen to your words, right? And what are their words? The kingdom. Okay, now, here's the second part. Okay, somebody receives you, and then you're like, hey, I'm here to proclaim a message from the Messiah. The kingdom is at hand. And then someone's like, yeah, that's weird, culty, strange stuff. You got to get out. What does Jesus say? Dust your feet off and leave. But he says if they do receive you and they do listen, then what do? You stay and you let your peace rest upon it. The word for peace in Hebrew is shalom. This is like the great peace of God. More than just like peace, man. It's more like wholeness and completeness and goodness. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question. If Jesus sent these disciples to this certain place only to speak to the Jewish people, then these were Jewish homes
Yeah.
that they were knocking on.
Mm-hmm.
If they were good Jewish people that believed in the Torah, they should receive these disciples.
They should. I think Chester taught on it, or else he commented when I was teaching on it. Jesus is very concerned about this, that you can believe the Torah and know what it says and not live it out in your heart. Remember, the whole Sermon on the Mount is about this. What Jesus is saying, I want you to go find people who believe it and they also live it, so much so that when they open the door from you knocking, their first instinct is, come on in. You need something? You need food? You need a place to rest? You need water? I'd be glad to give it to you. So they're already pre-programmed to say, these are the people who get it. The second thing is hard for Jews to hear. The Messiah is here. His kingdom has come near. And if people want to say, like, that's interesting, I'm not totally sure I get that. Could you tell me more about it? Jesus says, stay there and keep telling them about it. Tell them about it with your words, but also what else have you been told to do? Heal, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. He's given them authority to do all of those things. Okay, he says if they don't do this, that you are to shake the dust off of your feet. Now I think this is an interesting kind of thing to understand, because I think that what we can do is we can take this, we can take the concept and run with it as though we're called to do the exact same thing. That doesn't make any sense. Let me try to flesh this out. So most scholars call what just happened, Jesus sending out the disciples, they call it the limited commission. Which of course is in contrast to what other commission? The Great Commission. So this is not the Great Commission. This is the limited commission. The limited commission is limited to the Jews. Okay, so we have to know that this is more of like a special task force strike mission than it is, this is your mission for the rest of all time, eternity, right? Because these guys are going to return to Jesus and continue in the ministry. What Jesus is having them do is kind of like a training ground, because you're disciples and you're going to be like me. So this makes sense because what Jesus says to warn them of is very, very serious. So we'll get there in a second. So he is sending them out to determine who in Israel has embodied the Torah to the point where they want to receive the kingdom of God. That's what the goal is. He's going to do it by first testing whether they're actually Jewish in their hospitality, which they should be. If they are, Jesus says, stay and offer them the kingdom of heaven. If they accept that or they want to know more, stay. If they don't, shake the dust off your feet. Now, this is an interesting concept. This is a prophetic judgment, is what this phrase is. To shake the dust off your feet means there is absolutely nothing, not even a grain of dust, that I want to have in common with you. Does that make sense? I don't even want the dirt on your floor inside your home to be on my clothes. That's how much I want to be distanced from you. That's what Jesus is saying. So if there are Jews who know the Torah, who won't even offer you the hospitality that it clearly lays out, or they'll offer you the hospitality, but they don't want to know what you have to say about the Messiah, the fulfillment of all Jewish things, then you don't want to be associated with them. I think what Jesus is saying is this is their chance. This is the limited commission. To shake the dust off your feet is, in Jesus' words, you proclaiming judgment, knowing that it will be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah than them on the final day. I don't know why I laughed. It's devastating. So let's talk about Sodom and Gomorrah for a second. What's that? Payback. I don't know about if it's payback or if it's just divine judgment. So Sodom and Gomorrah, who are our main characters? Lot, wife and daughters. Okay, so Lot comes in contact with these two guys. That's kind of how it's first told to us. We're going to find out later that they're not two guys, they're two angels or divine messengers. So Lot comes in contact with these two guys. And Sodom and Gomorrah is this perverse, terrible, dark place. Lot brings the two guys into his home. And he gives them hospitality. Right off the bat, he offers them hospitality. Check. Then, the town, it says, a contingent of the town starts knocking on the door. And they say, give us your guests because we basically want to sexually violate them. Right? And Lot slams the door and says, like, no. I'm a Jewish man of hospitality. I'm not giving you my guests for anything, let alone that. but they surround the place and they start kicking at the door and kicking at the walls and they're screaming for it. That's what they want, right? So what does Lot do? He says, in the spirit of hospitality to the stranger, I believe that to be so fundamental to who I am, you can have my daughters before I'm going to give them up. And in that moment, it's like the moment of faith where these two men reveal themselves as two divine messengers that say, you are worth saving in Sodom and Gomorrah because of your hospitality. And what do? First, they render all the men blind so that they can all escape. Then they escape, and what happens to Sodom and Gomorrah? I don't know how to draw an explosion, or else I would.
But didn't his wife turn back? Am I thinking of it?
Yeah, she turned around. She was told, don't turn around. She turned around, and she turned into a pillar of salt. Which is so interesting. I want to see a pillar of salt. Was it like pink Himalayan salt? Was it like, what kind of salt was it? I think I've said this before, but I heard this comedy bit once where the guy was like, he went to go get some salt, and it was the pink Himalayan salt. And he saw, and he was like, whoa, this is about to expire. Then it dawned on him, this is the stuff that you said has been at the bottom of the sea all the way to the Himalayas for 10 million years, and what are the chances that I just happen to buy it right before it expires? Okay, so that is what is being proclaimed when you wipe the dust off your feet. Jesus is saying, these people are so devoid of hospitality and welcome that there's nothing they're going to welcome. Not the kingdom message, not even you. They won't even welcome a blind or a hurting beggar or a day laborer. You don't want to be part of that. Judgment will come. They have had every opportunity. They know to look for the Messiah, and they're not looking for it. They know what the Torah says, but they're not doing it. That's what he's saying. I want to make note of this before we wrap up. I want to turn there because in Matthew chapter 22, I don't often try to go ahead in the story. I didn't know this until this week, but I started reading, and it turns out that like 4 or 5 different commentators that I like to read all pointed out that there's some connections, and to be honest, I don't think I'm smart enough to totally understand what they're saying. But they say that the story of the wedding feast is actually the culmination of this teaching about shaking the dust off of your feet and letting people be given over to judgment. The wedding feast parable goes like this. I'm just going to read it to you. And instead of maybe commenting too much on it, I'm just going to let Jesus, according to really smart people, tell you what this teaching means. And again, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. And he sent his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding feast, but they would not come. Again, he sent other servants, saying, tell those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. But they paid no attention, and they went off, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. The king was angry, and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, the wedding feast is ready, but those who were invited were not found worthy. Go therefore to the main roads and invite to the wedding feast as many as you find. And those servants went out into the roads and gathered all who they found, both bad and good. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came and to look at the guests, he saw that there was a man who had no wedding garment. And he said to him, friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment? He was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, bind him hand and foot, cast him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen. So they're making the connection that this is the deal, that these disciples are living out this parable. They're going to say you're invited to the feast. The feast you have been waiting for is here in Jesus, and it is for you. You have everything you need. You have your invitation. Now come. And they are treated shamefully. They're not given hospitality. And it says that the king has no tolerance for that kind of thing. And so he fills the wedding banquet with, as far as Jews are concerned, complete and total strangers. It's a very, very, Gentiles, yeah. One thing I find fascinating is the disciples are not told to go to the Gentiles explicitly until after Jesus has resurrected from the dead, which is the final moment that the Bible tells us that all people can be grafted onto the vine. Jesus is trying to give these people, God's covenant people, every opportunity to listen and follow. And sometimes we give people a bad rap, but we have to remember the Gospel of Matthew itself is written to Jews who have become Christians. The majority of early Christians are not Gentiles, they are Jews. So there is a contingent of Jews who hear and do believe, and they do listen. But there's sharp warnings for people who should know God the most and act the exact opposite. That's where we'll end tonight. A nice happy story like Sodom and Gomorrah. Any thoughts, any questions as we kind of wrap up? Yeah.
And something I just heard this past week that I hadn't really thought about, but with the Babylonian captivity,
Yeah.
the records of at least the 10 tribes of Israel were lost. So these people that were back in Israel now, probably a lot of them didn't know their heritage. So the idea of the restoration, the 12 could be seen as the restoration of the tribes of Israel.
So just so I'm understanding, you're talking about the people that Jesus is talking to.
Yeah, just like Matthew is saying that Jesus crossing over the Jordan is a symbol of like a reestablishing of these things. That the 12 will be a reestablishing of the 12 tribes of Israel, that the records have been lost now.
So the records of who belonged to what tribe had been lost, 10 of the 12. I had totally forgotten that. That makes perfect sense. So these people are not only hearing 12 as the perfect governing, but also like a reorganizing of what tribe do I belong to. I know I'm Jewish, but I don't know which tribe. Interesting. I didn't know that. That's really cool. I need to write that down. So if I ever do this again, this 5-year-long Bible study, I don't miss that part. Yeah, Cecil.
You know, we talked earlier about how the Pharisees accepted Jesus as a rabbi. But if you're reading back into the history of the Jews, only people coming from the tribe of Levi could teach in the temple. So how was it that they didn't question him because he wasn't from the tribe of Levi?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a distinction that he's not going in the temple. Well, he does go in the temple, but he's not teaching there. He's going to the synagogues, kind of the satellite teaching spaces. This is actually, I'll get to you in a second, Wanda. This is actually good to know because when Jesus is alive, there's an interesting thing beginning to happen. The idea of a rabbi is a trained kind of lay professional. So think Jesus is a carpenter, he has a trade, but he's also an expert in the Torah. So he's teaching the Torah. Evidence from the culture says he's probably maybe doing a little work on the side to make some money or whatever it might be. After the temple gets destroyed in, this is a date everyone should know, 70 AD, the idea of a rabbi changes dramatically. It becomes much more of like a ordained professional career position. Does that make sense? Also, after that, the synagogues go from more or less places where people just kind of come together and remind each other and read and learn about the Torah, and it becomes more central as like a religious service from start to end. The synagogue before this, so the synagogue Jesus is going into, I think is more of like a Jewish communal meeting space that has the scrolls that you could go in and you could bring people and you could begin to teach them. So when Jesus enters town and tons of people are following him, a synagogue is a good place to go. It's a communal meeting place. After 70 AD, when the temple is destroyed, the synagogue becomes more like an established, maybe more like we would think of it as like a church that does services and all of the rites and all of those sorts of things. So this is happening not long after Jesus is resurrected. 70 AD is when Rome just decides, forget it. We've had enough of these people. They keep revolting. They keep having issues. We can't let this go on, and so they send in the military. And what's interesting is Caesar says to not leave one stone unturned. It's written. Not to leave one stone on top of another, which about 25, 30 years, 40 years before, Jesus said there will be a day when there's not one stone on top of another. And it's completely, utterly wiped out in 70 AD. Only one wall, more or less, remains kind of sort of intact, and it's still there today. It's the Eastern Wall, where Jews call it the Wailing Wall. If you see pictures, it's the big rock ground, and people write prayers and put it in, and they wail and cry that that's not their temple. It's just where their temple used to be. So, any other thoughts? Yeah, Wanda.
In regard to his question about Jesus being a rabbi too, we always forget that he is related, Mary is related to Elizabeth, whose husband he was a priest in
Yeah.
the temple. So there is a kind of a Levitical type of heritage there in his background. I mean, we don't know Jesus' background and stuff like that, but
Yeah.
I'm sure that the Jews of the day understood, Zacharias and Elizabeth, and that knew who they were. And
There was a familial connection to Zacharias, who when his lot was pulled, he went to the temple because he was part of the tribe of Levi. Yeah.
right.
Yeah. So it could be that somehow that connection is how Jesus became a rabbi. We don't know. We do know, this is the last thing I'll say, we do know from Luke that Jesus is in the temple as a young guy. How old does it say he is? 12. Right about the time he would be kind of finishing up formal school and establishing whether he was going to go towards following a rabbi. And it says that even rabbis have gathered around him and are like, wow, this is a extremely bright guy at 12, 13 years old, right? So pretty interesting. Let's pray. We can have more conversations about this as long as you want, but let's, just for the sake of time, wrap up for now. God, thank you for just all the discussions and the ways that our minds start to work and dots start to be connected through studying your word. We just pray that you would continue to lighten it before us, that it would be a light unto our path. We ask that you would just continue to reveal interesting things that we're curious about, that you would just pique our interest, that we would want to know more, and that would lead us into deeper relationship with you. So we love you. We ask that you would go before us into kind of this holiday season. Sometimes bring the best and the worst of families and relationships. We ask for your peace and your grace over us. We ask that we would remain safe from all the things that are going on in the world, and that we would return just more excited and interested than ever to learn from your word come January. So we love you, and we're so thankful we get to do this together. Amen.